I would like to start today's session by thanking all of you all for being here today. And we had gotten a great response yesterday for our first lecture, and this is the second lecture in the Politics of Childhood lecture series. Today's lecture is going to be on how Hinduism has shaped our understanding of the child. Before I go on to introducing the lecture and our speaker, let me first introduce myself. My name is Ria. I'm a teacher and a research associate at NIRMAN. I'll be moderating today's session, so there will be a question answer round at the end, and I look forward to the conversation that it leads to. This is our fourth edition in the monthly NIRMAN lecture series. So, since you have already signed up, you will be receiving future updates of our sessions as well. And yeah, welcome to today's lecture. As I said, the topic is how Hinduism has shaped our understanding of the child. Professor Nita Kumar will talk about the ideas of the child in the Hindu culture and how various practices and beliefs in Hinduism have influenced our understanding of children and their childhood, especially the influences that our folk culture has. The way that our folk culture influences our understanding of the child, our ideas of the childhood, but they're generally unexamined. So she's going to put forth her argument and her analysis of how childhood has been influenced in the Hindu culture and in Hinduism. Uh, there will be a time at the end of the session for a question and answer round. I'll just do a quick introduction of our today's speaker and the organization NIRMAN. NIRMAN is a not-for-profit organization. We are based out of Varanasi. We work in the Banaras district and also 12 adjoining villages. We started our work in 1990, so this is almost our 30th year working in the fields of music, education, arts, and research. We run an innovative school called Vidyashram, the South Point School. We have two campuses, one in Banaras city and another one in Betawar village, which is 10 kilometers off Banaras. Ours is an integrated school, so that means that children from diverse backgrounds, students from families of farmers, weavers, daily wage workers, researchers, professors, entrepreneurs, they're all part of our school. They all sit together and they work together. We also run a research wing called the Center for Post-Colonial Education, and we host study abroad programs. And we always, we love to collaborate with educators and artists in different fields. Through our artist studio, which is the third wing of NIRMAN, we collaborate with artists from various backgrounds in music, virtual arts, theatre, martial arts. Generally, when our schools are functioning, our school calendar filled with these projects throughout the year. Now, just a little bit about our lecture before I about our lecturer and speaker before I hand it over to her. She's known as Nita Ma'am to me and mostly everyone at NIRMAN. She's completed her Ph.D. from University of Chicago. Her fields of research have been history of modern India, Russian and European history, anthropology. She has taught at the University of Chicago, Brown University, and University of Michigan, amongst other places. She recently retired as a professor. Before that, she used to take university courses about South Asian history, gender, and Bollywood. So you can expect a lot of movie references in her talk. Over the years, of course, and most importantly, she's also the director and founder of NIRMAN. So for 30 years, she's been engaged in writing curricula, training teachers, teaching, writing and working on children's books, children's films. Over the years, she's devoted a lot of her time training people in education. So not just teachers at NIRMAN like me, but also students from DLED colleges, teachers from different organizations, students from Miranda House, Lady Shri Ram College have come in for training sessions. And in fact, internationally, we have had a group of students from Lewis and Clark College, University of Washington, and Columbia University, amongst a few names. Before I take up more of your time, I would like to now invite Professor Nita Kumar to to begin her talk for today's lecture. Just a small note before I stop speaking. We will have a question and answer round at the end of the session. So Professor Kumar will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will have a question answer round for 10 to 15 minutes at the end. Thank you so much.
All right, so can you hear me, Ria? Is that fine? Am I
Yes.
on? Okay,
Yes.
good. Now all I have to do is to be able to pin myself and
You don't need to pin yourself if you want to see all the participants.
oh, okay. Well, anyway, um, welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you will continue to do so, and we can continue to have a dialogue about children from all kinds of different perspectives. So this is an unusual one that we are doing today to talk about children and childhood and Hinduism. It's unusual because one rarely hears that term, Hinduism. I mean, ours is such a majoritarian country, meaning that we have a preponderance of one religion, that it's taken for granted that, of course, people are Hindus. And so, for instance, there are so many surveys of children and education and childhood. They don't mention that word ever. They don't talk about religion, actually. They do make a lot of references to environment of the child, the socio-economic background, the context, the ambiance, and so on. And they skirt around the issue that there is actually a religious element there, and that in most cases, all the children they're talking about are actually Hindu children or children of Hindu families. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that we have, as scholars, typically avoided using that term. And there are a couple of good reasons for that, which I want to share with you. One is that there is this aura of Orientalism. For the longest time, the British and other Western people divided up the world in such a way that Indians were seen as more religious and spiritual and godly compared to the more industrial, rational, progressive, modern West. So we don't want to fall in that trap by distinguishing some kind of religious characteristics of the children that we talk about. And another reason might be that we are actually very familiar with Hinduism, and we realize that unlike many other formal religions, it is a formal religion, but it's not an ism in the same sense, and that it is much more a conglomerate of beliefs which are very diverse, very heterogeneous. And we may not be doing justice to all that diversity and heterogeneity if we use a blanket term such as Hinduism. So we might want to avoid it for that reason. We're actually very much in tune with everyday life and people, but we know so that term is a tricky one and very heuristic, very generalizing. So these are good reasons for avoiding using that term. But on the other side, I would say, a very good reason for not avoiding it and actually using it is, I think that today, in today's India, more precisely speaking, there is a kind of hijacking of the religion called Hinduism by different names in different places and contexts by political parties and leaders. And that should not be permitted without a counterattack, a struggle, a debate, and so on. So if we actually do not agree with and we object to many of the definitions of quote unquote Hinduism that are being launched and being progressively accepted, then we should in fact be very careful to always bring in whichever aspect of a child's holistic life does have to do with aspects of this religion. You understand what I'm saying? I'm saying that even if earlier we were a bit careless about it, right now it behooves us to make sure that we are stressing that very diversity or flexibility or whatever it is that we want to stress with regard to the religion that a child experiences growing up, because every child does experience it. It's part of their socialization. So that's one good reason, a political reason. And a second one is that, in fact, even if all of us are educators and many of us are scholars, and we prefer secular definitions of identity, and we like to think of things which are more important than religion in a child's life, such as individual rights and agency and so on, that is fine. But when we are talking about children, their milieu might not be the same as what we like, prefer, or profess. Their milieu might, in fact, take many aspects of religion very seriously, even though we don't. And in order to, again, do justice to the child holistically and to pay attention to the nitty-gritty details of their context, it's important to talk about what is the relationship of children in India to what is called Hinduism. And again, I'm qualifying my terms. Let me dispense with that by stating right away that Hinduism is not one thing. It's a very, very heterogeneous thing. It's a collection of various kinds of beliefs which are regionally differentiated and differentiated over time, as well as region, community, language, and all kinds of other divisions. And of course, childhood likewise. Childhood is also such a construct which is not homogeneous, and there are many, many kinds of childhoods, and they have differed in time and place. So given that fact, given the fact of diversity within both the concepts we are talking about, we should still try to discuss what is the relationship between what is understood in different ways as Hinduism and what we mean when we speak about childhood and children. Okay, so that's my little introduction to the talk, and I hope you are with me, that with all those qualifications, we can still do a constructive job of discussing this relationship. And I'm going to do it by looking at the history briefly, and then the sociology and literary kind of important constructs which we have. So when we look at history, here are 4 or 5 important points about our ancient period. And I'm using that periodization, even though it's a problematic one. I agree with all the scholars who have problematized it, that there are not 3 periods called ancient, medieval, and modern in India, in Indian history, but indeed 6 or 7 important ones. Having said that, I still want to talk about the ancient period as one that includes the Vedic period and the classical period, and then the epic period and so on within it. To begin with, and remembering that there is no thing called Hinduism in the Vedic period. The best way to describe the religion of that time is as Vedism, right? The religion of the Vedas. Having said that, there are not only continuities between that period and today, especially in liturgy and ritual, but if you go by, let people speak for themselves, well, Hindus like to trace their genealogy back to the Vedas, and they like to cite the Vedas as their sacred books, and so be it. I mean, not a lot of harm is done as long as we dissect everything very carefully. So here are some interesting, important points about that period. The first is that all the creation myths have to do with birthing. So the idea of giving birth is very important, which automatically gives the idea of childhood, children, etc. importance. And there is no question that whenever we talk about our gods, the Hindu gods, there is, for the most part, a discussion of many of them either as children or how they came into being, and all the varieties of childhoods that may exist between divine beings. And then there's a lot of emphasis on family relationships and kinships. So this is, of course, both a reflection of society as it actually must have been, and a desire to construct a model for society. So it's very, very useful then for us to know that this idea of being born, of being a child, etc., has a very high evaluation in Hinduism. As opposed, if you want to think about it, some other religions where you have adults always, all the gods are adults. I mean, there are miraculous births in other religions, you know, the Buddha and Jesus and so on. But that's it. You don't have a huge amount of then generation of constructs around that. But in the case of Hinduism, there is a whole body of literature about male gods as children and also female gods. A bit less, because then there is the idea of mothers, right? So the relationship is important, but women or female gods are often worshipped as mothers, literally ma, and also as children. For example, um, Ganga is mentioned, the river Ganga, at least in the Ganges Valley, right, where I'm located right now. Ganga is worshipped as a mother all the time, but there is a lot of narration and discourse of her before she became a mother, right? When she was a maiden, when she was youthful, when she was young, when she was a girl, she was dynamic and energetic and uncontrollable and so on. And the same is the case with people who, it's counterintuitive. We often think of goddesses like Sita in the Ramayana and Draupadi in the Mahabharata as being primarily wives, and dutiful wives at that. But the truth is that there is a lot of literature which is not as well known, and the primary sources exist if we were only to look for them, about both of them, both Sita and Draupadi, in their earlier version and as independent agents. When they are very youthful, one is born of the fire, one is born of the earth, and they're known by their names of their birth, and they have immense amount of mythology and then rituals which are based on that mythology, which scholars have then examined for different parts of India. Many of them are popular local rituals and practices in the heart of the Himalaya villages, or in local South Indian villages and so on. So one doesn't know them within mainstream Hinduism. Mainstream Hinduism is much more dominated by males and by the classical version of everything. But the local and popular versions do have a lot of celebration of goddesses as young girls. Now, another interesting thing about the Vedas is that although it is completely about a patriarchal society, and so that the main ritual, which is the sacrifice ritual, has a male priest and a male officiant, the person who is responsible for the sacrifice, the patron. However, as scholars such as Laurie Patton and Stephanie Jameson have shown, there are many shlokas in the Vedas that may be interpreted to show the importance of women also in the sacrifice ritual. So if you want, there is a lot of scope for investigating some of these things. One of the points that I always make, I made it yesterday also, is that when we are searching for things that we want to find, so if we are worried about the rights of people, the rights of women, we are concerned about equality, it's of course good to dig up all the deficiencies in that in the past. But at the same time, the other perspective to never lose sight of should be what were other kinds of things that we are overlooking which actually gave power to this submerged or depressed class. And I go so far as to claim there was an incipient and an indigenous feminism. It's not a modern phenomenon, that there was a kind of feminism at all times, which has as spokespeople both women and some men. And although the records are very few and difficult to find, there are some records, and scholars do find them, and scholars make a lot of wonderful pursuit of questions that actually all of us want to see answered, like, did women have any rights in the Vedic period? Okay, so it's not what some people would claim politically, that they were so great and noble and so on. It's not like that. It's about people from castes but you can read into the rituals some kind of place for women. Now, let me make clear that the importance of birthing, the importance of childhood, is actually not for anything to do with the child per se. It's not about the child. It's really about adults and their communities, which they want to see possess a certain status. And in order to maintain the status, you have to preserve what they consider to be the purity of their lineage, right? And in order to preserve that, you have to be very, very particular about the birthing process, right? So ironically, this leads to the control of women and the control of the rights of and freedoms of women. But at the same time, it gives importance also to this kind of process and the lineage and therefore the child. So it's the male child that we're talking about. It's upper castes and classes that we are talking about. But let's, given that, qualification, let me say that although it's the male children who bear the brunt of this continuation of the lineage, the girl child is also shown as valued in a different way. She doesn't have the obligation of performing rites for the ancestors or being the guardian of knowledge and so on. But at the same time, there are lots of evocative hymns in those oldest of books about how girls can be loved and cherished, and they are important and valuable to the community. So it's not a black and white case, and it's very important to know that. So the way that law is defined and called within this period emerges to be as dharma. And since you must know that that's also the translation in English of religion, here's a very interesting overlap. Dharma is understood as both the duty or obligation, in legal terms, the law, which people must follow. But dharma is also innate, and it's also the natural performance by people of what they are, what they must be, an expression of their conscience and their right living and right being. So dharma is perhaps one of the most complex of concepts. And this is crucial to us to understand for two reasons. One is that later, as I'll just come to it, in the modern period, in the British colonial period, this is one of the most distorted concepts. It comes to be one of the most distorted concepts. And the other, which is its opposite side, is that if we were to want to, we could use it very productively and constructively. One of the interesting things pointed out by a scholar, one of my favorite teachers actually, McKim Marriott, so I want to mention him by name. Please do read something by McKim Marriott at some point in time. So one of the things that he points out among many, many interesting discoveries he makes is that in Hinduism, there is no term for individual, rather the person, the self, is considered to be dividual, not individual, not someone who can't be divided, but dividual or someone who can be divided. This explains a lot of what happens in India, because a individual is by definition someone who can have multiple identities, who doesn't have the obligation to carry one singular identity, and then everything else becomes grounds for going to a therapist. I'm just joking, but I'm saying that this is a fruitful kind of unveiling of all the kinds of concepts that might lie there and be translated in a simplistic way, in a non-complex way. All right, so let's go on to the epics. And I don't need to go over the stories of either the Ramayana or the Mahabharata with this audience. I'm completely sure of that. But you do know that in both these epics, the story revolves mostly about children, families, their upbringing, their wrong upbringing, and then the trouble that these children, once they're adults, get into, and then what happens within the family and how it's all resolved, right? So let's quickly look at the Ramayana, and I'll say that there are two or three things that are striking about it. One is that all kinds of births are fine, right? Sita is found in a furrow. And in many, many versions of the Ramayana, she is supposed to be the daughter actually of Mandodari, who then discards her. Thus, she is found by King Janak in the furrow, because there is already the prophecy that she is going to be responsible for the death of Mandodari's husband, that is Ravan, right? So all this is tricky. Sita has a whole trajectory of her own. But what's interesting is that Ram, as a child, wonderful and glorious as he was, made many mistakes, and one of them was that he used to tease and torment the hunchback Mantra, and she never forgave him for that, and then got her revenge when he is about to be crowned as king, right? So the child has a crucial role to play right here. What we know probably most outstandingly about it is that King Dashrath needed progenies to carry on his name. And of course, he had multiple wives, but he wanted only sons, and he got only sons. Did he ever ask for a daughter? No. Did he ever even try for one? No. So there, you have to balance all this nice new importance and weight I'm giving to Sita, and I'm saying very pointedly that there is a lot of scholarship behind it. It's not wishful thinking or anything like that. You have to balance that with the fact that actually it's about boys, not girls, finally. And in the Mahabharata, I'll just point out the delightful twists that occur when the actual so-called author, which is Vyas, how is Vyas born? Vyas is born out of a very passing encounter between two people who want to have sex, right? And so then he is put away on an island. But then he is summoned to actually produce children, right? And he is so disgusting that the children that are produced through his being invited to cohabit with two stepsisters, I mean, forget that, foster sisters or something, I don't know what's the best description. The two children that are produced are disabled in different ways. One is pale, Pandu, and one is blind, Dhritarashtra, right? And thus starts a whole rigmarole of events, because each of them then has problems with their own children. One can't produce offspring, so the offsprings have to be the children of gods. And the other produces 100 offsprings who are so spoilt and so badly brought up, sad to say, that they cannot be controlled. And thus there is this ruinous war which destroys everyone, and all the mothers can only grieve for their children who could not behave themselves, who killed each other, and are all lying as corpses on the field. So if you were to read it right, there's lots and lots and lots of wonderful stories about children back in those epics. And one of the things I want to say before moving on is that we should not deny ourselves the useful repertoire of stories in our own mythology. I have hardly mentioned 3 or 4, and there are thousands to be used. And I, as an educator and someone running a school, I always wondered why I could get so much pleasure out of these mythological stories and consider them, they were sort of all complex, twisted, interesting, fascinating, but basically harmless. They were not going to control me in any way. They were just, the works of someone's imagination at a certain time. And I was very glad I belonged to that cultural world where such imagination existed. So why were these stories considered outside the repertoire of the things that we should use for children? And the answer is the same that I began with in the beginning. It's partly because of our colonial heritage, our desire to turn our back into what the British wanted for us, which is, Orientalized Asian spiritual beings, right? And partly because there is diversity there. And we are afraid that if we do one thing, it's going to turn off a whole lot of people, not only from other religions, but other sects within Hinduism, right? If I do something to do with Rama, there are lots of people who just worship don't come near Ram. And if I do something with Krishna, there are going to be lots of those who can't stand Krishna, and so on, right? So instead of that, it seems safer to maintain a distance from all that. But I would like to plead with everyone at this gathering to think more radically, to think more innocently, and to think much beyond the box, very creatively, and see if we cannot find our own ways of using our vast cultural resources and huge, rich, deep repertoire of stories, narratives and plots and stories in different ways for children, without getting sucked in to this whole problem of, why use religion, right? Let's come to the medieval times. And the thing about Hinduism, because it is a period dominated by various dynasties in all but the southern tip of India, who were Islamic. So it's the Bhakti saints who straddle many, many centuries at this time, who are very relevant to us for our understanding of childhood. So again, I know much more about North India than South India, but there's lots and lots of wonderful stuff on South India, on the two schools of Bhakti, the followers of Vishnu, right? The Alvars, and the followers of Shiva, the Nayanars. I have read them. I'm just not, an expert on that field. But I do know a lot about North Indian Bhakti. And it's interesting that this is the time at which the rule of law is becoming entrenched, including what's known as the Varnashram Dharma. So simply speaking, the caste system. The caste system is has become entrenched, and states are powerful. So people's lives were probably much more controlled and rigid. And the emergence of a figure like Krishna or Rama, and many of the things that are celebrated by the Bhakti saints, is partly a response to the political situation of that time. People wanted freedom, and what more freedom can you have than in the figure of a god as a child, and especially a god like Krishna. Krishna displays all the characteristics of a child that we may be familiar with, right? Willfulness, naughtiness, lying through his teeth, right? Uncontrollable energy, flitting around, playing with everything, and a kind of magical attraction that that sort of catches everyone within its magnetism. So as we know, there are two kinds of saints. One is the Sagun, which is what I want to talk about mostly, but I will come to the Nirgun ones. So the Sagun ones are those who pick on a particular form of the god and then personify that god and talk about the god very lovingly in intimate detail. And this includes the god as a child. There is no end to the literature, art, music, poetry, dance, etc., that has been generated by the child figures of these gods. And I probably can't think of anyone who doesn't know these North Indian songs written by Surdas and Tulsidas, etc. Maiya Mori, main nahi makhan khayo, right? In which Krishna is saying, Mother, I am not the one who stole the butter. And then he makes a whole lot of limp excuses, none of which can be believed. And similarly, Tulsidas about the child Ram, when he is just a toddler and learning to walk. And my heart goes out to this hymn or poem or whatever we should call it, Thumak Chalat Ram Chandra, when he's falling and he's getting dirty, and then he's being picked up by his mothers and foster mothers and so on. So there's a huge literature out there. And the wonder is that it continues to the present. So centuries after it was first generated, and that also orally, it has passed down, and then of course it became a written form, but it passed down orally, and even now it's mostly through performance and listening and then repeating that people know this. This is an important point to mention because it tells us two or three things. One is, as the scholar Paula Richman has said, for a form of poetry in Tamil Nadu called Pillai Tamil, if I'm saying it right, which is poetry for and to a child. In a book she's written called The Extraordinary Child, there is a kind of preference for this relationship uh, of humans to God to be expressed as mother to child, right? So you are actually addressing the God as a child, as someone who is going to somehow be your benefactor, but they are just now so innocent that you have to protect them. So there is that that aspect of it. And the second one is about the continuity that I was saying, which is that there must be a lot of admiration, respect, and certainly attention given to the fact that the strength of our culture, or whatever you want to call it, our traditions, is reproduced through oral performance, is reproduced through oral literature. That, you know, nowhere is Hinduism taught in schools. How do children ever learn Hinduism? What is a child, how is a child going to develop as a Hindu, emerge as an adult who is a Hindu? And the answer is because all around there are these performative genres. So again, you know, when I look at my own experience, I went to Catholic school and never, ever, ever in the school premises encountered anything to do with Hinduism. And yet as an adult, I was not ignorant. I mean, I was not stupid about it. I may have actually been better educated, but I didn't know a whole lot. And I had to ask myself, how did I know it? And then it went back to the fact that always there had been something on the stage or in some kind of performance to do with Krishna, something to do with the Pandavas, something to do with the Mahabharata, Ramayana. Somehow I knew songs, somehow I'd heard of shloks and hymns, right? No one had very carefully planned it. It was just all around me. So sociologists who work on the family do understand this. Historians who work on the family, such as myself, understand it, and we pay a lot of attention to the changes within the family. In other words, if there is some strength to what's called the joint family, and to the fact that there are multiple caretakers in a family, the changes within that towards more nuclear families, towards less gendered roles of caretakers, to women more working outside and spending less time in the domestic site. These changes are going to affect socialization of children. They're going to weaken this natural kind of socialization that I was discussing. And then in the long run, not very long, maybe in just a generation, there's going to be much more ignorance about any Hindu values, practices, stories, or anything that children imbibe than there is at present. And you can already see it if you look around you. Present day school going children, or maybe even college going youth, could be quizzed, if you like, on some things that we think we know very well from our own childhood, even if you're not scholars of the subject. And the reason would be that the family is progressively become weaker in their socialization. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to move on to the modern period. Okay, so let me keep an eye on the time. And there are, again, about 3 or 4 important points to be made about Hinduism in the British colonial period. The first is that the British changed around the legal system, and they thought they were preserving the dharma of the Hindus, but they did it in such a distorted way, partly deliberately, partly out of ignorance, everything in a shortcut. So they, at the end of the day, left out pretty much what was most valuable about dharma. Dharma was a very flexible concept because it could apply to your age, to your caste, to your community, to your station in life, to your gender, and then to your personal preference, right? There are all these dharmas that overlap in any individual. But they gave it a new rigidity. They made it written, something that could be consulted from a book, something that could be applied in a law court. And the actual rights of certain groups of people, which include lots of people on the ground, but specifically women, were curtailed, and they were made smaller than before. So Hinduism became a smaller category, a much more less inclusive and much more rigid category during the British. One of the main issues that took place and was the target of reform in the British period was the issue of child marriage. And this is a very tricky thing because it tells us that, of course, Hinduism did not have an idea of childhood in the sense of a modern idea of childhood. There was no dividing age when a child could be left alone. The child was sexualized at a very early age. And there was such a struggle over decades to have the age raised for girls from literally up to 12 and then moving on from there. And there were huge struggles fought in all parts of India, in the law courts and also unofficially, to have this kind of change made. And the rebuttal from the Hindu leaders, whether they were priests or intellectuals or whatever, was very, very strong. They actually did not want to let the control over girls and control over rights as they saw it out of their hands. One, for a good reason, they didn't want it in foreign hands, the British hands, but another because they were just patriarchal. And of course, when the control was moved from their hands, unfortunately, it went to the hands of the state, right? The new law made the state a new kind of patriarch. And the state is often as backward as some actual individuals could be. Often, I'm not saying always, sometimes the law does help, but initially, in the 19th century, it didn't prove to be that smoothly so. So this whole thing is discussed a lot in the feminist literature. We have wonderful studies of the issues of child marriage and the child wife and different cases studied in detail. I just want to move on by making one point here, that great as this feminist literature is, it sometimes loses sight of the fact that we are actually not talking about women. We are talking about a child. We are talking about the girl. And right, and there, you know, there could be, there's one case of an 11-year-old bride who died because of being married so early, right? And this case, etc., has to be seen as one of the examples of how we Hindus have thought about children and dealt with children until very recently. This is not more than 5-6 generations ago. I'm going to move on to some sociology quickly. And I want to just say that there are 3 or 4 very important, interesting things that I want to point out. One is that just like there are life cycle rituals for boys, and everyone knows about the thread ceremony for upper caste people and so on, there are life cycle rituals for girls also. And not only just Kanya Dan on the gift of the virgin, or Garbh Dan, the gift of the womb. These are to do with her sexuality again. But ordinary people, as opposed to classical Hinduism, that which comes from the texts, ordinary people practice a lot of rituals on the ground, and in short, actually give much more equitable attention to girls than do upper caste and upper class people. Another finding of sociologists is that this idea of multiple caregivers, caretakers, is actually a very, very enlightened idea. And it may be the idea of the future. So as in many aspects of Indian history, the pre-modern actually can leapfrog the modern and become post-modern in a very interesting way. I want to end by talking a little bit about a very interesting concept called Leela. Leela literally means play, and in a double way. Play as games and sports, as the play of the Lord, the play of anything, anyone. And Leela is performance, as a performed play, right? So the concept is a very fecund one. That means it's very fertile. And if you study all the different kinds of leelas and the ways that it has been applied, so not only performances, but you can meet a villager who'll say in a Hindi-speaking region, "Are ye to leela hai," meaning this is all just a play. It shows us that the idea of playfulness is of high value. Now, this goes completely against the practice of modernity, in which it's all about work, 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 and success through work. But in our own treasures of our own culture and religion, there is a lot of availability of ideas there. Again, I want to, it's a jargon word, but I want to mention to you something which I said about feminism earlier, that it's very interesting to think about discursive space. So discourses are those things that are very powerful, powerful in the sense of being sometimes unspoken, unstated. So unlike ideologies, which are very powerful, a discourse is powerful because it is so ingrained or entrenched within a culture. At the same time, there could be what I call a discursive space, meaning that there is a dual discourse. There is one which is on top, which is the patriarchal one, but there's one which is underneath and hidden, but available for when you want to use it. Now, the same thing applies to children as to girls and women, which is that although children are discriminated against, and as I said yesterday, adults don't seem to understand them, want to understand them, strive enough to understand them. At the same time, within our own society and culture and history, there is the availability of ideas which we could tap in order to make something like play legitimate again. Yeah, it's a challenge. One would have to think about that and see. So there is lots of lovely stuff about children and childhood in the literature of all the diverse languages of India, especially in memoirs, but also in fiction. Each one of them talks about a very specific childhood, located obviously in a caste or class or region or locality, in particular villages, in particular cities, how children grow up, how they are nurtured and socialized, their relationships with different family members. All this has to be looked at and considered before we make any generalizations about Hinduism. Let me stop here and say more in response to some of your questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for the talk. I personally find this topic very interesting. I hope everyone who's listening in did too. So I want to start with one question, and I think it's a repeated theme. So maybe you can answer that, and then we'll go into shorter questions. Just a minute. Yeah. So the first is, the common narrative a child ever gets from religion or mythology is either in the form of superhuman feats or unquestionable power. And generally this is, held by men. I'm trying to fuse 2-3 questions together as I've read them. The realism, metaphors, and the intense moral dilemmas, even God's face is largely left out. It's a lot of direct, there's no gray area to some things. So how do you train teachers and caregivers to address something like this? So this was first about mythology and folklore and religion. The second is directly on the discrimination that exists due to the virtue of Hinduism, the Vedic texts that are there, and there's discrimination that has perpetuated through those texts. So as a teacher, how do you just teach the folklore but leave out these extremities that the religion has perpetuated? So I think these 2 questions are quite heavy. So let's...
Yeah, let me just answer them. Let me try to answer them. Yeah. Let me take the second one first. And so, of course, the epics. Now, I mentioned the Ramayana and the Mahabharata as 2 of them. They are all about upper caste people and upper class people, very rich people, ruling classes. And in both epics, there are ordinary people, even animals, and all kinds of marginalized groups, but they play very subsidiary roles. So it's not about them. The epics were historicize them, they were composed as a genre that was primarily performed in the courts of kings. So they sang about the deeds of kings, right? They were not popular performances. But you can find popular performances, and that's what one should look at. It's not at all that India is ruled only by these epics. They have gotten a lot of audience and a lot of name and fame and so on. But that's what happens with classical things, especially once they are made into classics and they are put into the canon, right? But there are, I mean, for instance, there's a scholar called Hildebrand. And what has he done? He has toured all the parts of India, especially South India, and dug up in all kinds of localities and villages, all the different versions of these, which actually highlight only local people. And the same has happened in the Garhwal region. William Sachs is a scholar who has done that. So in their scholarship, you find that they are completely sidelining the main epic, and they're talking about ordinary people and how they interpret the story, how they live out the story. And actually people do that in the villages. When they perform something, some episode from one of the epics, they don't do it in the same way that you and I are familiar with. They do it in a completely reversed way. And it's someone else who is at the center of the tale for them. So this discrimination is partly made by us. You know, you can reverse it when you like and when you want, because the material exists there. What I'm saying is that actually the majority of people in a country are not upper class people. They are ordinary people. And you can be sure they don't lead barren lives. Their lives are very rich in performance and culture and narratives. So we have to get at those things. And there are scholars who have done that. So we don't have to do it personally if you like. We can use the scholarship that already exists. One of my projects at NIRMAN, at our organization, I invite you all to join me. It still has to, you know, bear fruit and be seen properly through. But one of my projects is actually to write stories for children which take from all these things, but reverse them in the ways that we want them to be reversed. You know, all of them have reversed versions, and they can be further reversed. Now, the first question about the fact that most children are exposed to big deeds of big people, and especially big male people, and who are not humanized enough. So we don't know about the problems they might have faced or how they managed to become so great and big, right? And this is a real problem. You know, I hate to mention things by name as a critic, but I do know that there's a scholarship about this. So I'm not saying I'm doing it. Other scholars have done it, but they've critiqued a genre. They've critiqued this thing called Amar Chitra Katha, for instance. Amar Chitra Katha has become extremely influential in being able to expose children to our mythology. But according to the scholars who have made a detailed study of it, they have distorted most stories, and in ways in which the males seem to be dominant, even when the story is actually about someone like Durga or Kali, right? So instead of Durga or Kali being given the central importance that the original story gives them, it's actually about the Mahishasur or someone, and then enters Durga or Kali as relatively, you know, timid figures, though it's hard to imagine them as timid, right? Especially Kali. But to the extent that it can be done, it's been done. So again, I will say that become a critic, use all the secondary literature which is critical of these things. A lot of it exists, and I'll be happy to give you as many references as you like. I mean, I hesitate to mention too many scholars or books or anything, because that's a sure way to lose people. But all this exists in writing, and I can send you the links to various articles and other people's work and all that. And you can join the circle of critics and therefore use their you know, honed expertise to produce things for your own students and children.
All right. Thank you. I hope that covers a lot. Like I think this was a repeated theme that kept coming. So I'll end with two last questions. We will be exceeding our time by 5 minutes. I apologize. 5 to 10 minutes. So please stay in if you are interested. Next question. I'll just read it out. Do you think that there was deterioration in the understanding of childhood with time in ancient India, such as with the laws of Manu as compared to Vedic and Puranic times? This is one question.
I mentioned, I missed one word. Just read it again, Ria, please.
So, was there deterioration in our understanding of childhood when we compare it to the law of Manu versus Vedic and Puranic texts? That was the one questions. There's one question about again Vedic and Puranic times about work and child relationship and if there was concept of child labor during that time. And if you can provide a contrast to the apprenticeship model that existed in medieval Europe. That and yeah, I think these are the last two things. Maybe if we have time, I'll do one more question at the end.
Yeah, I think that most people find that there is a quote-unquote deterioration because of the nature of society. You see, if it's a tribal society, which is what the earlier society was, the Vedic society was a tribal society, and the Mahabharata reflects that. At the time of the Ramayana, kingly states are already being formed. And after that come empires. So by the time that there is someone called Manu, who didn't exist, of course, but by the time the Dharma Shastras are written and all this is codified, these are very settled agricultural societies. So a settled society and a kingly state on an empire have very codified rules and very rigid social setups. And that, of course, means some kind of limitation in individual freedom, which is what you're saying, compared to tribal societies, which are much more open, much more egalitarian, much more in the making. They just have not moved on to that fixed state yet. That's the explanation. It's not that one is a problem and the other is so great or anything like that. It's just a historical process that is occurring and with state formation. I just want to put a quick note here that the Dharma Shastra, Manav Dharma Shastra, is not to be taken as some kind of description of what existed. It's more like a book of sociology, which tries to give you an abstract description of society, but you can be sure, you can be certain, 100% certain, that on the ground, the reality was not like what's depicted there. And it's almost like to say, methinks he protests too much, right? There is an extremism there, which is difficult to accept as practical. About child labor, there is no such notion as child labor. The whole idea of varnashram dharma, there are two parts to it. One is the varna, one is the ashram. Ashram means stages in life, and it's mostly for men, for boys. So you have a long period of education / training / apprenticeship in which you are specifically prepared for your trajectory in life. And everyone's career path is different. There's no homogeneity as in modern societies when everyone should have the same liberal education. No, it's dependent on your caste, community, family, background, that you have a certain kind of training in life. But that is, according to me, perfectly healthy and acceptable. It's so transparent that that's what's going on. What is objectionable, according to me, is in the modern system to have ostensibly equality, but actually it's completely a division between the haves and have-nots. And so what you have is availability of the same resources to everyone, but closed gates actually, so that the rich only go to the rich schools and the poor only go to poor schools. You already have a streamlining, whereas earlier it was very transparent that, you know, that's an upper caste person, that's the education he's getting. This is a cobbler or a merchant, and that's the education they're getting. So there is a certain virtue to transparency. And this so-called child labor thing is part of that. At that time, which is the first ashram, brahmacharya, you're supposed to be getting training for whatever your course in life is. It's completely open and legitimate. And the Varna part is the other part, which is that there are these 4 Varnas, and within that there are hundreds and thousands of castes. And then there is a distinction according to what caste you are. And you have accordingly, again, child labor, because every single caste or community socializes their children, used to, I'm talking in the past, to get what we would call apprenticeship within their own chosen profession. Everyone used to do that. Everyone did it, and that was the way things were run.
All right, thank you so much. We did get 2 more questions, but they are slightly longer and they're best addressed in our lecture notes. Thank you so much for joining in today. And you will get a newsletter with the next monthly lecture series. And if you have any more questions to ask, you can send me an email, and I'll make sure that we add them in the lecture notes. Thank you so much for coming today.
And thank you from me. Bye-bye.